Every year I keep track of all the books that I read in a Google Doc. In 2022, I read 55 books, which is a little more than one a week and is about average for me. Look, I spend a lot of hours on the subway every day, which gives me plenty of time to read. Some of the books that I read were absolute masterpieces, and some were total clunkers that I absolutely hated. I'm gonna give you my top 10 books that I read this year in no particular order. The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. A lot of the books that I read this year I learned about from another book that I read, The New Journalism, Conversations with America's Best Nonfiction Writers on Their Craft by Robert S. Boynton. Kind of a mouthful. It's a book of interviews with journalists who are part of the post-New Journalism generation. People like Susan Orlean, John Krakauer, Lawrence Wright, and Eric Schlosser. Virtually every single person interviewed cited The Right Stuff as a seminal influence on their work, so I knew that I had to read it. I had seen the movie in high school, and to be honest, I didn't really love it, so I wasn't all that excited to read this. But once I did, I was totally blown away. It tells the thrilling and fascinating story of America's rush to put a man into space, and the group of fighter pilots who are enlisted into the cause. It's like a real-world Top Gun, only they're going into space in a tin can that they can't steer. They're an all-American crew of fighter pilots, all possessed with the righteous stuff, and who spend every waking moment, as Wolfe writes, flying and drinking, drinking and driving. Their entire existence becomes devoted to trying to tame, again, quote, hot and dangerous machines out in the middle of the desert, all the while becoming the most famous people in the country. It lets you into this unbelievably fascinating world of fighter pilots and the larger-than-life mythology that surrounds them. People like Chuck Yeager, the beloved hero of fighter pilots who was so cool that pilots tried to imitate his relaxed and slightly southern style of speech, and is apparently why airline pilots all talk the way they do today. The whole, well folks, we've reached our cruising altitude of 20,000 feet thing. It's all because of him. It's so fun to read, partly because of Tom Wolfe's vivid rhetorical style. I can see how his flavor of writing isn't for everyone, but I loved every single exclamation point and rhetorical flourish. I will definitely be reading this book again in the future. The Passage of Power by Robert Caro. My love of Robert Caro and his LBJ series is well documented. I've done a whole other video about it, which you can watch here. Or here. This is the fourth book in the LBJ series, and I'd been putting off reading it for so long because Caro is still working on the fifth and final book. I dreaded being left with no more Caro to read, but I finally bucked up and inhaled this book like everything that he writes. The story begins with the 1960 presidential election and Johnson's vicious battle with Kennedy for the nomination, which, spoiler alert, Kennedy eventually won. It then details the tedium and despondency that Johnson experienced as Kennedy's neutered vice president, until the fateful day in Dallas in 1963 when LBJ was suddenly thrust into the presidency, reigniting his political instincts and re-energizing him to push for massive legislation in his first months in office. I mean, what can I say about this book? I love Robert Caro. The section about the campaign is pulse-pounding political journalism without compare. The wheeling, the dealing, the absolute bloodthirsty feud that existed between the Kennedy brothers and Johnson, which is almost Shakespearean. This book is about Johnson, but what Caro is so good at is giving the reader almost side biographies of the other characters. I didn't know a ton about Robert Kennedy, but the portrait that Caro paints of him is utterly fascinating. My next favorite part of the book is a thoroughly detailed TikTok of the presidential visit to Dallas, told from Johnson's perspective. Almost from the moment the president is shot, you can see Johnson's leadership instincts kick into action. There's a sequence when Johnson is sequestered in a hospital room by the Secret Service, and he's silently standing there, drawn into himself, and you can almost see the gears of power turning in his mind, charging himself up for what he knows is coming, his long wished-for ascension to the presidency. You then get to see a detailed explanation of exactly what happens when a president is killed and how the mantle of power is transferred through the line of succession. Caro is so thorough and precise. It's a breathless read that I couldn't put down, and I'm waiting anxiously for the fifth installment to come out. How to Win The Bachelor by Chad Kultgen and Lizzie Pace. This may seem like an odd inclusion into the list, but hear me out. Chad Kultgen and Lizzie Pace host an excellent podcast called Game of Roses, where they recap and analyze The Bachelor like it's a professional sport, which they argue it is. In order to write this book, they did a hyper binge of every episode of every season of The Bachelor, keeping meticulous track of every single data point available. Which player got a rose at which point in the game, the number of kisses each player gets, which archetype each player falls into, etc. They were incredibly meticulous and detailed, analyzing exactly what it takes to win The Bachelor from a statistical point of view. It's an impressive, hilarious, and astonishing piece of data journalism, and one that ignited a passion for The Bachelor that shocked even me. The Invisible Bridge: The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan by Rick Perlstein. Rick Perlstein has written 4 books chronicling the rise of conservatism in the US, and this book focuses on the end of Nixon's presidency and fall into disgrace, as well as the rise of Reagan. Perlstein is an amazing writer, par excellence, as they say. He's both incredibly intelligent and savagely hilarious. This book also really sets the stage for how we got to the landscape of the Republican Party that we're seeing today. It also paints a vivid and not very flattering portrait of Ronald Reagan as a pretty mediocre actor, as well as a self-serving son of a bitch who seemed to have been physically incapable of telling the truth about anything. Every single one of Perlstein's books is worth reading, and they illuminate the kind of conservative politics that we're unfortunately seeing today. There is Power in a Union by Philip Dre. I've probably owned this book for about 10 years and always hesitated to pick it up, primarily because it's so damn long. But I'm glad that I finally did, because this book is incredible. It essentially lays out how every lever of power in the US was designed to repress the working class and to quell labor from getting too much power. Does it sound like this book radicalized me? You bet your ass it did. It really blew my mind how there was example after example after example of how local government, as well as the federal government, have used horrifying violence to put down labor uprisings. And many, many examples of labor activists being wrongfully executed after trials that were obviously a sham. I lived in Chicago for years and didn't fully understand the reality of the Haymarket affair until I read this book. And needless to say, I was genuinely shocked. The issue of workers' rights in the US is literally one of life and death, and Philip Dre chronicles it in exacting detail. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. This was the first book that I had read by Carson McCullers after many, many years of meaning and wanting to, and I loved it. Aside from the title, which I would argue is perfect, this novel feels so incredibly modern, even though it's over 80 years old. The book was also published when McCullers was only 23 years old, showing a level of maturity decades beyond her age. 23-year-olds are normally little garbage people, so it's amazing to me to be passionate about something that somebody that age does. The cast of characters is so well crafted and her style of prose is so compelling. I really don't know how somebody so young can write a story that's this rich and thoughtful. Tragically, she died at a rather young age and only left us 4 novels, but I'm excited to read the rest of them soon. Answered Prayers by Truman Capote. This is Capote's final unfinished novel. He essentially wrote a story talking about his friends and acquaintances, and after serially publishing it in magazine form, his friends all abandoned him, leaving him with an unfinished manuscript that he never completed. It seems to be a pretty divisive work with a lot of people hating it, but I personally ate it up. It's bitchy, it's horny, it's gossipy, and it's full of references to real people you might recognize, and who were not thrilled to have their secrets revealed in book form. It's such an amazingly audacious undertaking. I don't think there's anyone like Truman Capote in our day and age, and I would venture to say that our culture is much less interesting for it. Unlike some other unfinished novels, when you read this book, you can't totally tell that it's a work in progress. Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. There's a type of book that gets so popular that you see swarms of people reading hardcover copies every day on the subway. I normally am suspicious of books that are this popular. I've been severely burned by novels like this in the past, where they get so hyped up in popular culture and then turn out to be duds. I won't name any names out of respect for the zeitgeist. This book is not that. I saw this book cover everywhere in the past few years. People on the subway, the recommended table at bookstores, on the bookshelf of every house that I visited. And it's one of the few pieces of contemporary literary fiction that lives up to this hype. This was such an engrossing story that had me hooked from the very beginning all the way to the end. My skepticism was immediately erased and replaced by amazement at Ng's masterful storytelling. It was also fascinating to learn about the Cleveland suburb Shaker Heights, which I had heard of but didn't know was so interesting. I had no idea that it was such a meticulously planned village with incredibly stringent zoning laws and building codes, down to the smallest detail like dictating where garbage cans can be placed and the color of houses. Celeste Ng just came out with a new novel this year, and I'm excited to read that one now too. The World Only Spins Forward: The Ascent of Angels in America by Isaac Butler and Dan Kois. I only read Tony Kushner's script for Angels in America for the first time in 2019, but it absolutely floored me. I was crashing at a friend's place and read both parts of it in one sitting. I literally could not put it down. I was so profoundly moved and amazed by it, it felt like I was reading a new form of writing. I very recently watched the HBO series for the first time this year, and tragically, I've never seen the play on stage. So I feel like a little bit of a phony saying that I like Angels so much, but this book, which is an oral history of the entire life of the play, from its inception to productions which are currently being done today, totally captivated me. Isaac Butler and Dan Kois interviewed over 250 people for this book, from virtually every actor from every production, to generations of playwrights inspired by the play, to Kushner himself. It's exhaustive. It covers literally every aspect about the play that you could think of. By way of a history of angels, it also gives a first-hand account of the history of the AIDS epidemic in this country. It's harrowing and tragic to hear all the testimonials about how AIDS ravaged the theater community in particular, and left a wake of trauma that continues to this day. But also how Angels served as a political rallying cry for generations of gay men specifically. The thing that I loved most about this book was hearing actors talk reverently about the play. One of my favorite things in the world is listening to actors talk shop and how much they revere and love theater. The adulation they have for Angels is like nothing I've ever heard before, and it really restored my love and faith in the passion that great art can spark in people. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. The final book on my list is also the longest. Some years ago I read an article about Edith Grossman's updated translation of Don Quixote, and how everybody was raving about how it breathed new life into the 400-year-old story. So naturally I bought the book and let it accumulate dust on my shelf for years. After a friend read it recently and loved it, I decided to finally pick it up. And it's normally hard to say this about a 1,000-page book, but I really honestly couldn't put it down. This book is so funny. I was literally cracking up every single time I picked it up. It's amazing that humor can travel down through the generations so well, especially because a lot of times when I read Victorian novels or books from previous generations, I feel like so much of it is lost in translation, that the jokes and references go way over my head. But it honestly feels like this book could have been written this week, which surely is a testament to both Cervantes' skill as a writer, as well as Grossman's masterful translation. The book is chock full of humor and some of the most memorable characters in literary history. But it's ultimately one of the saddest things I've ever read as well. By the last page I was crying, exhausted from having read such a behemoth tome so quickly, since I couldn't stop. And I was also regretful that it was all over. These are the 10 favorite books that I read this year. I read more than these though, so here's the full list if you want to pause and check it out. Have you read any of these books? What were the favorite books that you read in 2022? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in 2023.